For 34 years, this stretch of quiet road in Granite Bay, California, carried a question nobody could answer. A mother of two walked into her sister's house on a Monday afternoon to clean it. She never walked out, and the only witness was 11 months old. A warning to our viewers. What you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. On the afternoon of November 25th, 1991, a man pulled into the driveway of a house in Granite Bay, a suburb northeast of Sacramento. His 4-year-old daughter was with him. He was there to see his wife, who was cleaning her sister's home that day, the way she did most weeks. He walked inside. The house was silent. His wife's shoes were by the door. Her coat was still there. Her car was parked outside, exactly where she'd left it. Nothing was knocked over. Nothing was broken. There was no sign that anything had happened in that house at all, except for one sound. In the dining room, strapped into a high chair, their 11-month-old daughter was alone, and she was crying. Nobody knew how long she had been crying. Nobody would ever know. The woman who had been standing in that room less than an hour earlier was gone. She had vanished out of a locked suburban house in the middle of the day, leaving behind her shoes, her coat, her car, and her baby. The only thing missing with her was her purse. Her name was Cindy Wanner. She was 35 years old. And what happened to her would become one of the most notorious cold cases in the history of Placer County, California. It took 34 years, one final piece of evidence, and a technology that did not exist in 1991 to finally put a name to the man who took her. Before we go any further, if you're new here, this channel covers cold cases that took decades to solve. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you stay until the end of this one, you'll find out how the killer vanished off the face of the earth for 20 years. Why the state had been warned, in writing, about exactly what he was before Cindy ever disappeared. And why the person who helped him hide was the last person anyone expected. Now, back to the case. Cynthia K. Wanner, Cindy to everyone who knew her, was born in 1956. She and her husband had moved their young family from Thornton, Colorado, to the Sacramento area for a fresh start. They settled in Rancho Cordova. Cindy cleaned houses for work, and she was the kind of mother who didn't like being away from her kids, so she often brought them along, a bucket of supplies in one hand, a baby on her hip. That was her life. Ordinary, careful, full. By November of 1991, she had 2 daughters. The older one was 4. The younger one was 11 months old, still in a high chair, still learning her first words. November 25th, 1991 was a Monday. It was the week of Thanksgiving. That afternoon, Cindy drove to her sister's home in Granite Bay to clean it. The house sat on a secluded lot, screened by trees, even though a busy road ran close by. The kind of property where you can stand in the driveway and not be seen by a single passing car. She brought the baby with her. She set her daughter up in a high chair in the dining room with some snacks, said goodbye to her sister and brother-in-law as they headed out around 12:30 in the afternoon and got to work. Roughly 45 minutes later, her husband stopped by the house. He had their 4-year-old with him. 45 minutes. That is the entire window. Somewhere inside those 45 minutes, in the middle of a Monday afternoon, in a quiet suburb, 3 days before Thanksgiving, a man entered that property, took a 35-year-old mother out of that house, and disappeared with her, without breaking a door, without overturning a chair, without leaving one visible trace that he had ever been there. The Placer County Sheriff's Office launched a massive search. Deputies canvassed Granite Bay. The story led the local news. A mother taken out of a family home in broad daylight, her baby left behind. It rattled the entire Sacramento area. Granite Bay was the kind of community where people didn't lock their doors. They started locking them, then came the first thread. In the days after Cindy vanished, her ATM card was used. Fraudulently, someone out there had her purse, and they were pulling money out of her account while her family was putting up flyers. Investigators worked the transactions. But in 1991, there were no cameras on every machine, no digital trail worth the name. The withdrawals stopped. The thread went dead. For 3 weeks, her family lived in the space between hope and the thing they would not say out loud. Thanksgiving came and went with an empty chair. On December 14th, 1991, 19 days after Cindy was taken, a hunter was moving through a remote wooded area outside Foresthill, near the edge of the Tahoe National Forest. Rough, forested country roughly 40 miles from her sister's house. He found her. Cindy Wanner had been raped and strangled to death. And then the pathologist reported the detail that her family would have to carry for the next 34 years. Based on their examination, they believe Cindy had not died on November 25th. She had been kept alive for days after she was taken, while the search teams were out, while the flyers were going up, while her daughters were asking where she was. She was alive somewhere, with him. Investigators now had a homicide. What they did not have was a suspect. No witness had seen a vehicle. No neighbor had heard a scream. The house had given them nothing. No forced entry, no struggle, no fingerprints that led anywhere. Whoever took Cindy Wanner had done it fast, clean, and in daylight, and then driven her 40 miles into the mountains. Evidence was collected from the scene and from the autopsy and preserved. Biological material. In 1991, DNA analysis was in its infancy. The technology to pull a full profile from what investigators had recovered and a national database to compare it against did not meaningfully exist. The evidence was sealed, logged, and placed into storage. It would sit there for more than 3 decades. The investigation ground forward through 1992 and beyond. Tips came in and fell apart. Persons of interest were looked at and released. Detectives kept the file active, but every road ended the same way, in silence. The case that had terrified a suburb slowly slid out of the headlines. The detectives who caught it retired or transferred. New investigators inherited the file, read it cover to cover, and reached the same conclusion every time. Every actionable lead had been run into the ground years ago, but Placer County never closed the book. Over the years, as DNA science advanced, the sheriff's office kept going back to that evidence box. Item after item was submitted for testing, and item after item came back the same way. Degraded, partial, insufficient. The DNA was there. The technology just couldn't read it yet. Each time the evidence went back into storage and the file went back on the shelf. Cindy's daughters grew up without her. The 4-year-old became a teenager, then a woman. The baby from the high chair learned about her mother from photographs and other people's memories. She has no memory of her own, of the woman who set her up with snacks in that dining room and told her she'd be right back. 34 Thanksgivings came and went. Now, while that family was waiting, there was another timeline running, a parallel track that nobody had connected to Granite Bay. To understand what actually happened on November 25th, 1991, you have to go back 11 years earlier to a house in Sacramento County. In 1980, a man broke into a home. Inside were a 71-year-old grandmother and her 11-year-old granddaughter. He beat the grandmother brutally, and he raped the child. He was caught. He was convicted. And when he was sentenced, psychiatrists working for the state of California put their assessment of him on the record. They classified him as a mentally disordered sex offender. And they added 4 words that should have ended the story right there. Not amenable to treatment. In plain language, this man cannot be fixed. The state's own doctors said so. He was sentenced to 19 years. He served 11. In early 1991, California released him. He walked out of prison and back into Sacramento County, a registered high-risk sex offender whom the state had formally documented as untreatable. 10 months later, Cindy Wanner disappeared from her sister's house in Granite Bay. And here is the detail that sat buried in the files for 34 years. His registered address in 1991 was approximately 1.4 miles from the location where Cindy's ATM card was last fraudulently used. 1.4 miles. The man pulling money out of a missing mother's bank account was doing it in his own neighborhood, and nothing in 1991 could connect him to it. His life after the murder tells you everything about who he was. In 2002, he surfaced briefly, arrested for failing to register as a sex offender. And then, around 2005, he did something that very few people ever truly manage. He vanished. Completely. No address, no records, no trail. Investigators who went looking for him found nothing. As Placer County Sheriff Wayne Wu would later put it, it appeared that he had simply disappeared since 2005. A convicted, high-risk, untreatable sex offender, gone, like he had never existed. He had a sister. Over the years, law enforcement contacted her multiple times. A retiree with a home in San Clemente, California. She told them every time the same thing. She hadn't heard from her brother in more than 20 years. She had no idea where he was. She told detectives that, as recently as weeks before this case finally broke, remember her. She matters. By the 2020s, the Placer County Sheriff's Office had a dedicated cold case unit, and the Wanner file was one of the cases it would not let go. The unit had watched what was happening across the country. Cold cases from the 70s, 80s, and 90s falling one after another, as forensic DNA technology crossed thresholds that had been science fiction when the evidence was collected. Detectives went back to the box one more time. After years of submissions that had gone nowhere, they selected a final piece of original evidence, one of the last untested cards they had left to play, and sent it to the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office Forensic Lab, where analysts went to work on it with advanced DNA analysis that had not existed the last time anyone tried. This time, it didn't come back partial. It didn't come back insufficient. It came back with a name. The DNA recovered from the evidence in Cindy Wanner's murder belonged to the man from the 1980 home invasion. The man the state's own psychiatrists had branded untreatable. The man released after 11 years of a 19-year sentence. The man registered 1.4 miles from where her ATM card was drained. The man who had been off the grid for 20 years. His name was James Lawhead Jr. He was 30 years old when Cindy's was taken. He was 64 now, and nobody on Earth seemed to know where he was. The identification was only half the problem. You cannot arrest a ghost. Detectives had a name and a face from old booking photos, a face that was now 3.5 decades older. The sheriff's office even produced a video appealing to the public for help finding him. And then, investigators turned to a tool from the same new generation as the DNA analysis, facial recognition technology. Old images of James Lawhead were run against modern databases, and out of the desert, a match came back. A man living in Bullhead City, Arizona, a small city on the Colorado River on the Nevada border. He wasn't living as James Lawhead. He was living under an alias, Vincent Reynolds. He had been Vincent Reynolds for years. New name, new state, quiet life, no past. But dig one layer down, and the quiet life came apart. The home Vincent Reynolds was living in wasn't his. It was owned by his sister, the same sister who had told law enforcement over and over for years, as recently as weeks earlier, that she hadn't heard from her brother in more than 2 decades. Investigators established that the two of them had been in communication the entire time. She wasn't a bystander who'd lost touch with a troubled sibling. According to investigators, she was the reason a wanted man had a roof over his head. On Friday, April 24th, 2026, officers moved on the house in Bullhead City. James Lawhead Jr. was arrested at his home and booked into the Mojave County Jail on charges of kidnapping and murder, awaiting extradition to California. The next day in Lancaster County, South Carolina, his sister, 71-year-old Terry Lawhead, was arrested and charged as an accessory. The day after that, detectives served a search warrant on her San Clemente home. 34 years, 2 arrests in 2 states in 2 days. On Monday, April 27, 2026, the Placer County Sheriff's Office stood in front of cameras in Auburn, California, and said the words Cindy Wanner's family had waited half a lifetime to hear. Sheriff Wayne Wu called it arguably one of the most heinous, notorious cold cases in Placer County's records. And then the sheriff said something else, something you almost never hear a sheriff say at a press conference. He turned the blame on the system itself. The justice system in California, he said, is broken. And it was broken then, when it allowed James Lawhead to be released after serving only 11 years. The state had classified him as a sex offender who could not be treated, and it released him anyway. 10 months later, Cindy Wanner was dead. The district attorney, Morgan Geyer, filed 1 count of murder against Lawhead, with 2 special circumstance allegations: murder during the commission of a kidnapping and murder during the commission of a rape. Special circumstances. In California, that phrase means one thing: the absolute maximum was on the table, and the sheriff's office added one more thing: a request, not to the public, but to other police departments. They asked law enforcement agencies across the West Coast to pull their own unsolved files from the 1990s and 2000s and look for cases that resembled this one. Because a man who did what was done to Cindy Wanner 10 months out of prison and then successfully erased himself for 20 years is not a man investigators assume did it only once. Where James Lawhead was and what he was doing between 2005 and 2026 is a question that is still open. The case moved fast after that. Extradited to California, Lawhead was facing the full weight of the special circumstances, a mountain of DNA evidence, and a courtroom that would hear about the highchair. He never let it get that far. In June 2026, James Lawhead Jr. stood in a Placer County courtroom and pleaded guilty: murder, kidnapping, and he formally admitted both special circumstances, that he killed Cindy Wanner during a kidnapping and during a rape. As part of the agreement, he waived his right to appeal. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole, no trial, no years of hearings dragging the family back into courtrooms. After 34 years of nothing, the end came almost quietly. A 64-year-old man in a jail uniform admitting, in his own words, in open court, what he did to a 35-year-old mother in November of 1991. He will die in prison. On the afternoon of November 25th, 1991, 3 days before Thanksgiving, a mother stood in her sister's dining room and set her baby daughter up in a high chair with some snacks. She said goodbye to her sister around 12:30. She picked up her cleaning supplies and got to work in a quiet house on a secluded lot, 45 minutes from the moment her whole family's world would stop. Her shoes stayed by the door, her coat stayed on its hook, her car stayed in the driveway. For 34 years, the man who took her had a head start no one could close. First behind the failures of a system that had been warned about him in writing, and then behind a dead man's name in the Arizona desert, in a house his own sister kept over his head while she looked detectives in the eye and said she hadn't heard from him in 20 years. The DNA outlasted all of it. It outlasted the alias. It outlasted the desert. It outlasted every year the technology needed to catch up. It sat in an evidence box in Placer County, waiting until a lab in Contra Costa County finally taught it to speak. The baby from the high chair is 35 years old now, the same age her mother was. If this case stayed with you, let me know your thoughts in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.